February 19th, 1945. 30,000 United States Marines climbed down cargo nets into landing craft, preparing to assault a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean. The island was only 8 square miles, a speck of volcanic rock and black sand barely visible on most maps. Intelligence officers told the Marines they would secure it in 5 days, maybe a week at most. The Japanese defenders were cut off, without supplies or reinforcements. It would be difficult, but manageable. They were catastrophically wrong. The battle for Iwo Jima would last 36 days. It would become the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Nearly 7,000 Americans would die on that island. Another 20,000 would be wounded. 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima would become a casualty. The fighting would be so intense, so savage, that even hardened combat veterans who had survived other Pacific battles would call Iwo Jima the worst experience of their lives. 27 Medals of Honor would be awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American history. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later say of the Marines who fought there, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." That phrase would become forever linked with Iwo Jima, because only extraordinary courage could explain what happened on that island. But why was this tiny island so important? Why did the United States military commit 70,000 Marines and sailors to capturing 8 square miles of volcanic wasteland? And why did the Japanese fight with such fanatical determination to hold it? The answer lies in Iwo Jima's location and what it represented to both sides. The island sat directly between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and Japan itself. American bombers flying missions over Japan had to pass near Iwo Jima, where Japanese fighters would intercept them. Damaged bombers returning from raids over Tokyo had nowhere to land for emergency repairs. They would ditch in the ocean or crash trying to make it back to the Marianas. Hundreds of American aircrews had already been lost this way. If the Americans could capture Iwo Jima, everything would change. American fighters could escort the bombers all the way to Japan. Damaged bombers could land on Iwo Jima for repairs instead of ditching in the ocean. And perhaps most importantly, American radar stations on Iwo Jima could provide early warning of Japanese air attacks. The island was strategically priceless. For the Japanese, losing Iwo Jima would be catastrophic. It would bring American bombers one step closer to the home islands. It would demonstrate that Japan could not defend territory that was officially part of the Tokyo prefecture. Iwo Jima wasn't a distant colony. It was considered part of Japan proper. Losing it would be like losing a piece of Japan itself. So the Japanese sent their best defensive commander to Iwo Jima with orders to hold it at all costs. And the Americans sent 3 divisions of Marines with orders to take it. What followed was a battle that would test the absolute limits of human endurance, courage, and sacrifice. This is the story of Iwo Jima. This is the story of 36 days of hell. To understand the battle for Iwo Jima, you must first understand the island itself and the brilliant, determined commander who prepared its defenses. Iwo Jima, which means Sulphur Island in Japanese, was a volcanic wasteland shaped roughly like a pork chop. Mount Suribachi, an extinct volcano, dominated the southern tip of the island, rising 550 feet above the beaches. The rest of the island was a plateau broken by ravines, covered with volcanic ash and studded with rocks. Nothing grew there except scrub brush. There were no trees, no villages, no fresh water. The island stank of sulfur. Steam vents dotted the landscape, releasing noxious gases. The black volcanic sand was so fine and loose that walking through it was exhausting. Vehicles would sink to their axles. It was, by any measure, one of the most miserable pieces of real estate on Earth. But it was also the perfect defensive position. The Japanese commander on Iwo Jima was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, one of the most capable officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. Kuribayashi had served as a military attaché in the United States before the war and understood American industrial capacity and fighting methods better than most Japanese officers. He knew that Japan was losing the war. He knew that the defense of Iwo Jima was ultimately hopeless. But he was determined to make the Americans pay such a horrific price for the island that they might reconsider their demand for unconditional surrender. Kuribayashi abandoned traditional Japanese defensive tactics. There would be no banzai charges, no suicidal attacks on the beaches. Instead, he would turn the entire island into a fortress and bleed the Americans white in a battle of attrition. He had 21,000 men under his command, and he intended to make every single one of them count. The general put his men to work building the most elaborate defensive system the Americans had yet encountered in the Pacific. They dug 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 caves and underground positions. These weren't simple foxholes or bunkers. They were multi-level fortifications carved deep into the volcanic rock, some as much as 75 feet below the surface. The tunnels had multiple entrances and exits, allowing Japanese soldiers to move from position to position without being seen. Artillery pieces were mounted in caves with carefully camouflaged firing ports. After firing, the guns could be rolled back into the caves, where they were invisible to American aircraft and ships. Machine gun nests were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across every possible approach. Mortar pits were dug with overhead cover to protect them from airstrikes. Every position was sited to support multiple other positions. If the Americans attacked one strong point, they would come under fire from half a dozen others. Kuribayashi personally inspected every defensive position, ordering changes and improvements. He positioned his strongest defenses not on the beaches, but inland, where American naval gunfire would be less effective. He stockpiled ammunition and supplies in the caves, knowing that once the battle started, there would be no resupply. He drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them to hold their fire until American troops were at close range, then to inflict maximum casualties before falling back to the next prepared position. The general wrote letters to his family that revealed his state of mind. He knew he would not survive the battle. He knew his men would not survive. But he believed that if they could hold Iwo Jima long enough, if they could inflict enough casualties on the Americans, it might give Japan negotiating leverage in peace talks. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope he had. American intelligence knew that Iwo Jima was heavily defended, but they had no idea of the true extent of Kuribayashi's preparations. Aerial reconnaissance showed some defensive positions, but the camouflage was so good that most of the fortifications remained invisible. American planners estimated there were 13,000 Japanese defenders on the island. They were off by 8,000 men. They estimated the battle would last 5 days. They were off by 31 days. The pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima began in early December 1944 and continued intermittently for 74 days. American aircraft and warships pounded the island with thousands of tons of high explosive. They could see some positions being destroyed, but they didn't realize that for every position they destroyed, there were 10 more hidden underground. The Japanese sat in their tunnels, enduring the bombardment, waiting for the Americans to come ashore. They knew the real battle would begin when the Marines landed, and they were ready. In the final 3 days before the invasion, the bombardment intensified. Battleships and cruisers ringed the island, firing at point-blank range. The noise was constant and overwhelming. The island disappeared behind a curtain of smoke and dust from exploding shells. Surely, American commanders thought, nothing could survive such punishment. But deep in their tunnels, Kurebayashi's men waited, largely unharmed. The general had built his fortress well. Now it would be tested against the finest amphibious assault force in the world. The morning of February 19th, 1945, dawned clear and calm. Perfect weather for an amphibious assault. At 6:42 in the morning, the final naval bombardment began. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed a storm of steel on Iwo Jima's beaches. Carrier aircraft screamed overhead, dropping bombs and strafing suspected defensive positions. The Marines, watching from their ships, thought nothing could survive such firepower. They were about to learn how wrong they were. At 8:59, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. The initial landing went almost too smoothly. There was no enemy fire. The beaches were empty. Marines poured ashore, expecting fierce resistance that never materialized. Some veterans whispered that maybe the bombardment had actually worked this time. Maybe the Japanese were all dead or stunned. It seemed too good to be true. It was. The beaches on Iwo Jima weren't normal sand. They were volcanic ash, fine as powder and loose as water. Marines tried to move inland and found themselves sinking ankle-deep, then knee-deep into the black sand. It was like trying to run through loose flour. Men exhausted themselves just trying to move forward. Vehicles bogged down immediately. Tanks and trucks became stuck as their tracks and wheels spun uselessly in the loose volcanic material. The Marines struggled forward, climbing the terraces that led up from the beach. They had penetrated maybe 200 yards inland when Kurebayashi sprang his trap. He had ordered his men to hold their fire until the beaches were packed with Marines and equipment. Now, he gave the order to fire. And the island erupted. Artillery and mortar rounds began falling on the beaches with devastating accuracy. The Japanese had pre-registered every inch of the landing areas. They didn't need to adjust fire. They simply fired on predetermined coordinates where they knew the Americans would be. Shells landed in perfect patterns across the beach, tearing through clusters of Marines who had no cover on the exposed volcanic sand. Machine guns opened up from hidden positions in the terraces and from Mount Suribachi. The Marines suddenly found themselves taking fire from positions they couldn't see. The Japanese firing ports were so well camouflaged and so well protected that even direct hits from tank guns often failed to destroy them. Marines would assault what they thought was a destroyed pillbox, only to have it come back to life and cut them down. The beach became a killing ground. Landing craft continued to arrive with more Marines and supplies, and they landed directly into the maelstrom. Boats were hit by artillery fire and exploded. Others broached in the surf, spilling men and equipment into the water. The wounded began piling up faster than corpsmen could treat them. The dead lay where they fell, because there was no time to collect bodies. Everyone was focused on survival and moving forward. Navy Corpsman John Bradley, who would later become one of the 6 flag raisers on Mount Suribachi, went to work immediately when he hit the beach. He ran from wounded Marine to wounded Marine, ignoring the incoming fire, treating sucking chest wounds and traumatic amputations and shrapnel injuries that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He watched Marines he had trained with, laughed with, eaten with, die in front of him. And there was nothing he could do but move on to the next wounded man. The Marines pushed forward because that's what Marines do. They advanced through fire that should have pinned them down on the beach. They used flamethrowers to burn out pillboxes. They used satchel charges to collapse tunnel entrances. They called in naval gunfire support on Japanese positions, then charged through the smoke before the enemy could recover. It was brutal. Close-quarters combat where the advantage went to whoever was more determined to survive. By nightfall on the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. They had captured a beachhead about a mile long and several hundred yards deep. The cost had been staggering. Over 2,500 Marines were casualties on the first day alone, killed or wounded. The casualties far exceeded predictions, and this was just the first day. The beach was so packed with destroyed vehicles, supplies, and casualties that subsequent waves had difficulty finding places to land. That night, the Marines dug in and waited for the expected counterattack. In every previous Pacific battle, the Japanese had launched banzai charges at night, trying to push the Americans back into the sea. The Marines set up defensive positions and waited. But Kurabayashi had forbidden any such attacks. He knew they would be slaughtered by American firepower. Instead, he ordered his men to stay in their positions and prepare for the next day. The battle would be won by attrition, not by glorious charges. The Marines spent a sleepless night listening to Japanese movement in the darkness. Occasionally, flares would light up the battlefield, revealing a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Black volcanic sand, smoking shell craters, destroyed equipment, and the dark bulk of Mount Suribachi looming over everything. Dawn came with a cold rain, and the Marines prepared to continue the attack. They were learning that Iwo Jima would be unlike any battle they had fought before. And they were learning that 5 days had been a fantasy. This battle was going to last much, much longer. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end of Iwo Jima like a malevolent fortress. From its summit, Japanese observers could see every American position on the southern beaches. They could direct artillery fire with perfect accuracy. They could watch every American movement and report it to their commanders. As long as the Japanese held Suribachi, the Americans would be under constant observation and fire. The mountain had to be taken. The 28th Marine Regiment received the mission to isolate and capture Mount Suribachi. It was a daunting task. The extinct volcano was honeycombed with caves and tunnels. Machine gun positions covered every approach. The slopes were steep and offered little cover. And approximately 2,000 Japanese defenders were dug in, ready to fight to the death. The regiment's commander, Colonel Harry Liversedge, knew this would be the toughest fight of his career. The Marines began their assault on Suribachi on D-Day itself. But progress was agonizingly slow. Every cave had to be cleared individually. Flamethrower teams would advance under covering fire, spray burning fuel into cave entrances, then withdraw while riflemen watched for any Japanese who emerged. Demolition teams would seal caves with explosives, only to discover that many caves had multiple exits, and the Japanese would simply emerge somewhere else. The fighting around Suribachi was personal and savage. Ranges were measured in yards, sometimes in feet. Marines and Japanese soldiers fought with rifles, bayonets, grenades, knives, entrenching tools, and sometimes their bare hands. There were no grand tactics at this level. It was simply a matter of killing the enemy before he killed you. Marines who survived later said they couldn't remember individual incidents. The days blurred together into one continuous nightmare of combat. Navy corpsmen performed miracles keeping wounded Marines alive. They worked under fire, crawling from man to man, applying bandages and morphine syrettes, while machine gun rounds kicked up volcanic sand around them. Some corpsmen were killed while treating the wounded. Others were wounded multiple times, but refused evacuation until they had treated everyone they could reach. The bond between corpsmen and Marines on Iwo Jima became legendary. Marines knew that if they went down, a corpsman would come for them. That knowledge gave them courage to continue advancing. By February 23rd, the fourth day of battle, Marines had fought their way to the base of Suribachi and were beginning to climb its slopes. A 40-man patrol from EZ Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, was selected to attempt to reach the summit. They expected fierce resistance. Instead, they found that most of the Japanese defenders had withdrawn into caves or had been killed in the 4 days of fighting. The patrol reached the summit at 10:20 in the morning and found a length of pipe. The patrol leader, First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, had brought an American flag with him. The patrol attached the flag to the pipe and raised it. Down on the beaches and on the ships offshore, thousands of Marines and sailors saw the flag go up and began to cheer. After 4 days of horrific combat, here was a symbol of victory. Photographers captured the moment, but the flag was relatively small and not easily visible from all parts of the battlefield. Later that morning, a larger flag was sent up to the summit. 6 Marines, including Navy Corpsman John Bradley, raised this second flag while Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment in what would become the most famous photograph of World War II. The image of those 6 men straining to raise the flag on Mount Suribachi became an instant symbol of American determination and sacrifice. 3 of the 6 men in that photograph would be killed in the fighting that followed. The other 3 would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the fame and trauma that came from that single moment. But the flag raising, as symbolic and important as it was, did not end the battle for Iwo Jima. In fact, the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. Securing Mount Suribachi had taken 4 days and cost hundreds of casualties. Now the Marines had to turn north and assault the main Japanese defenses in the center and northern parts of the island. Kuribayashi's strongest positions were still untouched. The real battle for Iwo Jima was just beginning. Marines looking north from Suribachi could see a hellish landscape of ravines, ridges, and rocky ground. Intelligence officers had identified particularly strong defensive positions and given them names. The amphitheater, Turkey Knob, the meat grinder. These weren't just fortifications. They were killing grounds where Japanese defenders had created defensive systems so strong that frontal assault seemed suicidal. But the Marines had no choice. They had to attack, and they had to win. The flag on Suribachi had given the Marines a morale boost, but it had also created a dangerous overconfidence among some commanders. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought the Japanese were broken. They were wrong. Kuribayashi had pulled his forces back into his strongest prepared defenses. He had allowed the Americans to take Suribachi because defending it would have cost too many men too early. Now, with the Marines committed to pushing north, he was ready to bleed them like never before. The worst was yet to come. The northern two-thirds of Iwo Jima was where Kuribayashi had concentrated his strongest defenses, and it was here that the battle reached its peak of intensity and horror. The terrain itself seemed designed to favor the defender. Ravines and rocky outcroppings provided natural defensive positions. Ridges offered commanding fields of fire. And everywhere, the Japanese had improved on nature's defenses with concrete bunkers, spider holes, and interconnected tunnels. The area that Marines came to call the meat grinder was actually a complex of 3 mutually supporting defensive positions: Hill 361A, the amphitheater, and Turkey Knob. These positions formed a triangle of interlocking fire. Marines attacking one position would come under fire from the other 2. Advancing was virtually impossible. Staying in place was suicide. The Marines had walked into a carefully designed kill zone, and men were dying by the dozens. Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas was 19 years old when he fought in the meat grinder. On February 20th, still early in the battle, Lucas and 3 other Marines came under fire from a Japanese position. As they took cover, 2 enemy grenades landed in their midst. Without hesitation, Lucas threw himself on both grenades, using his body to shield his companions from the blast. Miraculously, one grenade was a dud. The other exploded, tearing through his body with shrapnel. His companions survived with minor wounds. Lucas survived against all odds and would receive the Medal of Honor, becoming the youngest Marine to receive the decoration in World War II. Stories like Lucas's were repeated across the island. Marines performed acts of extraordinary courage not because they sought glory, but because in the chaos and terror of combat, courage was the only thing that could save their brothers. Men would charge machine gun nests knowing they would probably die, but hoping their sacrifice would allow their squad to advance. Others would hold positions against overwhelming odds to buy time for wounded comrades to be evacuated. The fighting in the meat grinder dragged on for days, then weeks. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions attacked repeatedly, taking horrific casualties for gains measured in yards. The Japanese defenders refused to surrender. When their ammunition ran out, they would fight with bayonets. When their weapons were destroyed, they would attack with grenades and knives. Some Japanese soldiers, wounded and out of ammunition, would wait in caves for Americans to approach, then detonate explosives, killing themselves and anyone nearby. Tank crews faced their own hell on Iwo Jima. The loose volcanic sand made maneuvering difficult. Japanese infantry armed with magnetic mines and satchel charges would emerge from hidden positions, attach explosives to tanks, and disappear back underground before the tank crews could react. Many tank commanders were killed by snipers when they opened their hatches for better visibility. But the tanks that survived provided crucial fire support. Their 75mm guns blasting apart concrete fortifications that infantry weapons couldn't touch. Flamethrower operators faced perhaps the most dangerous job on the island. The Japanese quickly learned to target anyone carrying the distinctive tanks and burner of the flamethrower. The operators had a life expectancy measured in minutes once they went into action. But flamethrowers were the most effective weapon against the caves and bunkers. The fuel would flow into defensive positions and ignite, creating an inferno that no one could survive. It was terrible, but necessary. And the men who carried flamethrowers knew the odds but did their jobs anyway. By early March, after 2 weeks of continuous combat, all 3 Marine divisions on Iwo Jima were exhausted. Rifle companies that should have had 200 men were down to 50 or 60 effectives. Some units had lost 75% of their original strength. The survivors were hollow-eyed and shaking, pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. But they kept fighting because the alternative was to leave the job unfinished and let their dead brothers' sacrifices be for nothing. General Suribachi, still alive and directing the defense from his command bunker, knew that defeat was inevitable but continued to exact a terrible price. His communications with Tokyo became increasingly fatalistic. He reported the situation honestly, never sugarcoating the reality that the Americans would eventually take the island. But he promised to make them pay for every foot of ground. And he kept that promise. The final Japanese defensive line was anchored on a position Marines called Bloody Gorge. It was a ravine about 700 yards long and 200 yards wide, with steep, rocky sides honeycombed with caves. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress from which there seemed to be no escape. The Marines had to clear it cave by cave, a process that took days and cost hundreds more casualties. Demolition teams would blast cave entrances. Flamethrower teams would pour fire into the depths. And still, the Japanese kept fighting. On March 16th, after 26 days of combat, the island was declared secure. But that declaration was premature. Organized Japanese resistance had ended, but hundreds of Japanese soldiers remained alive in the tunnel systems, and they continued to fight. Small-scale skirmishes and ambushes continued for days. Some Japanese soldiers would emerge from caves weeks or even months later, either to surrender or to launch final desperate attacks. The island wouldn't truly be secure until every tunnel was sealed or cleared. The final organized Japanese action came on the night of March 25th to 26th. General Suribachi personally led approximately 300 survivors in a final attack on American positions near the northern end of the island. It wasn't a banzai charge in the traditional sense. It was a calculated strike designed to inflict maximum casualties. The Japanese penetrated American lines, destroyed equipment, killed sleeping Marines, and fought until they were wiped out. Suribachi's body was never identified. He had promised Tokyo he would die fighting on Iwo Jima, and he kept his word. When the battle finally ended, the cost was almost incomprehensible. 6,821 Americans had been killed. Another 19,217 were wounded. Total American casualties were over 26,000 men, roughly 1/3 of everyone who had landed on the island. The Marine Corps suffered more casualties taking Iwo Jima than in any other battle in its history. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded, 14 of them posthumously. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, approximately 18,000 were killed. Only about 1,000 were captured, many of them too badly wounded to continue fighting. The Japanese had fought with a determination that bordered on madness, choosing death over surrender in almost every case. Suribachi's strategy of attrition had worked exactly as planned. He had made the Americans pay a price in blood that shocked even hardened combat commanders. But Iwo Jima served its purpose. By the end of the war, 2,400 B-29 bombers had made emergency landings on the island, saving approximately 24,000 American aircrew lives. Fighter escorts based on Iwo Jima provided protection for bombers hitting Japan. Radar stations gave early warning of Japanese air attacks. The lives saved and the strategic benefits gained justified the battle, though the men who fought there would carry the scars, both physical and mental, for the rest of their lives. Today, a memorial stands on Iwo Jima, now returned to Japanese control and renamed Iwo-to. The memorial honors both the American and Japanese dead, but the real memorial to Iwo Jima is in the hearts and minds of those who understand what happened on that island. It's in the Medal of Honor citations that tell stories of impossible courage. It's in the famous photograph of the flag raising that symbolizes American determination. And it's in Admiral Nimitz's words that perfectly capture what Iwo Jima represented. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. On Iwo Jima, for 36 days, ordinary young men did extraordinary things, and the world will never forget.